Hello and welcome to the first episode of Exploring Restoration with WaterLANDS, a podcast diving into the drivers, challenges and solutions to restoring our ecosystems, as seen through the lens of WaterLANDS, an ambitious Horizon 2020 Green Deal project aimed at learning how we can apply holistic wetland restoration at a landscape scale. In this series, we will talk to the people at the heart of creating and delivering on-the-ground wetland restoration in Europe, and the research and science supporting this work. Throughout the series, we will be delving into the ecology, governance, policies and financing of successful wetland restoration and the crucial role of community and the arts in empowering people to instigate better change for our future. Though the discourse around climate can be bleak, it is up to all of us to change the narrative and focus on what we can do now. Now that the European Union's historic nature restoration law has been passed, it is time to be proactive. Through this series, we aim to give you a valuable insight into what is being done and what we can do going forward so that you too can be part of it. Let's get started.
This episode is entitled Biodiversity in Europe and the EU Nature Restoration Law. So we're just going to start by asking you guys to introduce yourselves. And just talk a little bit about your background. So Craig, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. My name is Craig Bullock. I'm co-coordinating WaterLANDS. I'm a social scientist and environmental economist, and I've been working in this field since 1992, mostly in the area of the natural environment, having previously worked on projects in landscape change, forestry, recreation and the outdoors, biodiversity expenditure, environmental impact assessment. So yeah, I've been working in this field for a little while.
Yeah, my name is Shane McGuinness. I'm a co-coordinator of WaterLANDS as well. My background is kind of the hard science of pure conservation biology. I have cycled through various careers since then. I guess through the acknowledgement that in order to embed real change, you need to engage with people, and in particularly with young people. So I went through a period of environmental education, working in zoos and universities around Europe and the UK. More recently, then, I've started looking at how we afford all of this restoration that we need to do. So where does the money come from? So in particular, biodiversity finance, as Craig mentioned, but also the recent establishment of Peatland Finance Ireland, which is looking at mobilising blended finance for restoration of natural areas, in particular in Ireland, and in particular are at present peatlands, but hopefully not exclusively those habitats going forward.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. You were talking about all the restoration that we need to do. Could you tell us a bit about why biodiversity is so crucial to the health of Europe's ecosystems, and then what some of the most pressing reasons would be that we need to restore it?
Well, in the first instance, we rely on biodiversity to produce the food that we eat. We cannot produce food, at least we can't do it economically, without soil fertility, and that's maintained by the contribution that earthworms, other invertebrates, microorganisms, and fungi make to nutrient cycling. So biodiversity is absolutely essential in that area. Not forgetting either our reliance on biodiversity for pollination or pest control. And just like soils, we need biodiversity, fauna and flora, for maintaining water quality by removing excess nutrients and many toxins from the water, or for sequestering carbon from the air. So in the case of wetlands, wetlands are important for storing carbon, for retaining and purifying water supplies, and for mitigating storms and flooding. So in other words, our survival as a species depends on biodiversity. That's why the biodiversity crisis is often called an existential crisis. And all of this before we even start considering the contribution that biodiversity makes to our well-being, our desire to get outdoors, to experience nature, our sense of place, and in turn our physical and mental health. So yeah, biodiversity is pretty crucial in our lives.
I just briefly come in there and add that biodiversity as a term can often be what we call a terministic screen. It can hide behind a word that most people don't really understand. And hopefully an increasing number of people know what biodiversity means, but do we mean nature? Do we mean the natural world? Do we mean individual species? Or do we mean, as it should be, that the variability of all of that living stuff? And when I was communicating with young people in particular, it's a good place to start with 6-year-olds, I suppose, but describing why biodiversity is important is actually quite a tricky task. And the way I used to do it was with my watch. I'd take off my wristwatch and I'd hold it up and I'd say, I have no idea how this watch works. I know there are thousands and thousands of little bits in there, and they're all doing a job. And I know that if I take the back of the watch off and I take a couple of those bits out, it might still tell the time. If I take a few more bits out, it might tell a time, but maybe the wrong time. And if I take a few more bits out, then it'll stop telling the time altogether. And it's that level of complexity and the interaction between those different parts, which I think encapsulates what biodiversity is. It is the interaction of all those different essential parts that, for the most part, we don't understand the value of. But we do know that either it tells the right time, it might tell the wrong time, but nevertheless, it provides us with a valuable service. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Shane. And the next question I'm going to put forward to you is Europe has experienced significant biodiversity loss in recent decades. So could you explain the main drivers behind this decline and why it has accelerated?
Okay. Well, decline in biodiversity is a complicated matter, but it does have some fairly well understood drivers. Now, there's a larger philosophical question as to why we have not reduced those drivers, because many of them are well understood, like I said. The first is agricultural intensification. We have been converting land to agricultural use for many, many centuries now, and in particular, the wetlands of Europe. They were seen as wastelands and certainly of not much great value. So the best thing to do is to drain them, to clear them, to turn them into usable, if not profitable land. And that's had a massive consequence. The second main driver is the removal of some of our larger invertebrate species. And that hasn't just been connected with agriculture, but it's also been connected with the removal of what we see as pest species. So again, coming back to wetlands and clearing those to get rid of mosquitoes and the diseases that they may carry, or other airborne diseases or vector-borne diseases, I should say. Land conversion for non-agriculture, that's a big challenge as well. So obviously the removal of trees for that, or forests in general, but also the building up of urban systems. And then associated with the agricultural intensification, I suppose, is the application of artificial fertilizers, or indeed excessive levels of organic fertilizer. And that has a knock-on effect with the varying lower level ecosystems associated with that. And that includes the river systems, it includes the estuaries, and eventually the marine systems. But generally speaking, that's all around agriculture. It's stuff that we grow for ourselves. But there's also, I suppose, wild harvested species too. And I guess you could be thinking about whether it's native woodland originally, which there isn't a huge amount left of in Europe, but also in the oceans, and the over exploitation of what would otherwise deemed to be a common good, or a commons. And it comes back to Harden's tragedy of the commons and the fact that it's a common good and we should all take as much as we need, but there's always a benefit to somebody taking more than they need to gain a slight advantage.
It's interesting there to know what you said about invertebrates or insects, because we're conscious that we've lost so many bird species and mammal species and fish species, but we always kind of thought that insects were kind of immune from all this, but the world has lost about 40% of insect species across the world are declining, and we really depend on those for pollination, soils, everything, they really are quite critical. So that demonstrates just the sort of situation that we're in.
Nice. And then I guess that then brings us to talking about the EU Nature Restoration Law, which is aiming to reverse biodiversity loss across the continent. So Craig, what specific ecosystems or species are currently at the greatest risk, and how does the law address their restoration?
Well, in Ireland, we've lost a huge amount of our peatlands, which are really our only real true wilderness, and they're essential for storing carbon and water. However, very few blanket bogs remain intact, and hardly any razor bogs remain intact. Uh, Native woodlands and diverse species grasslands are also at very high risk in Ireland, and we have so few of them left, really. On species, it's particularly those species which, as Shane was saying, are associated with traditional farming practice that are being lost to farm intensification and removal of habitat. Species such as corncrake, curlew, once really familiar species in the Irish landscape, Irish hare as well. We've already lost, or as good as lost, the corn bunting and the grey partridge, both farmland species in principle. Across Europe, it's a similar picture. In Ireland, at least, we have seas which are in relatively good order, but in Europe, the whole Mediterranean is at risk. The same farmland transition that that's led to loss of so many of our species in Ireland is currently playing out in Eastern Europe. And then, of course, there's climate change, the effects of which are already being realized in the form of drought, forest fires, and forest dieback. So, yeah, there's a lot to be done.
And so, to follow on from that, for you, Shane, how does the loss of this biodiversity affect not just the environment, but also the social and economic fabric of European countries?
So the presumption here is that nature and humans lie separate, that there's this ideological separation between nature being over there and humans being over here, and we will take things from nature when we need it. Sometimes a nice bit of nature comes into our human world, into our garden, but it's often seen as a metaphorical or a literal fence in between the two. And therefore, I think we often disregard or underappreciate the social connectivity to this land, to these species, to these environments and vistas. And they've been appreciated by human society for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years, right back to East Africa, where you saw in cave paintings even people spending their spare time drawing nature on using charcoal or whatever it was. And we've kind of forgotten about that connectivity to a large degree. And importantly, we don't actually value it. We put a figure on the carbon, and we put a figure on the water. We put a figure on some of the other things that save us money or that earn us money. But we don't, and potentially can't, put a euro or dollar or yen on the amenity value or the pleasure that we get from this area, or the spiritual connectivity we get to the area, or indeed the cultural history underneath that area that we may never know, but we know is there. And unfortunately, associated with all of that loss of biodiversity, there's a loss of this value. There's a loss of that connectivity to these areas. Now, the caution there is that some of the value there we are attributing to areas that are anthropogenic in nature, that have always been, as far as we can remember, human induced or human created, farmland in particular. And Craig, you mentioned corn bunting and other species, those that would have been very prominent in an agricultural system, but actually pre-human, they may not have been that common. So we need to maybe question our social expectations and our social baselines as much as our ecological baselines. Are we expecting things to be perfect pre-industrialization human society, or are we expecting it to be exempt of any human interference at all? Just on a final point in terms of our connectivity, look across Ireland in terms of the place names that we have, and all of those place names that have an element or a specific reference to a species, whether it be a tree or a bird. Look at the coats of arms or the crests of various counties, or indeed families, and the number of species that are on each one of those crests. My own McGuinness has a deer on it. And across Europe as well, it's the same. Even flags of countries. One of them has a bear on it. The various different city-states that would have had associations with the local natural ecosystem, whether it was marine or forestry or even the agricultural realm. And that's something that we often don't appreciate. And unfortunately, if we want to value it, um, as we are taught at the moment, we need to put an economic value on it, which doesn't always work.
So then one of the big challenges often cited is balancing nature restoration with economic growth. So for Craig, how can we ensure that restoration efforts benefit both nature and local economies?
Well, they're consistent with one another, really. Over three-quarters of companies depend on at least one ecosystem service provided by nature that has its roots in biodiversity, be that the supply of food products, materials, natural materials such as wood or cotton, or other inputs such as natural oils. So we're very dependent. Business industry is very dependent on nature for those inputs. Wetland restoration will help secure some of those ecosystem services, in particular flood protection, water supply, water quality. And in doing so, that saves us money on building reservoirs or more intensive wastewater treatment and the like. Similarly, nature in the form of salt marsh and dunes, examples of which we're looking at within WaterLANDS, that's protecting our coasts from storms and sea level rise. So all this is necessary. All this resilience is saving us money, but also sustaining, our society and our economy. At a local level, natural systems are sustaining jobs in farming, artisanal fishing, or anything linked to outdoor recreation and amenity, which is a hugely growing sector. If you think about those occasions when you're on holiday, when you're walking anywhere, the amount of services, the amount of jobs that are created in the likes of pubs, restaurants, hotels, all that sort of thing, they all have that connection, direct or indirect, to nature and biodiversity. So you can see these are real examples of very significant and positive contributions to the economy, and local economies included.
Thank you, Craig. So next for you, Shane, is the EU nature restoration law sets very ambitious targets. So what are some of the major challenges in implementing these goals across the diverse regions and ecosystems of Europe?
Great questions. Oftentimes, I used to talk to students about if you want a horse, ask for a hamster. Um, in which, I mean, you need to be very ambitious in order to achieve what you realistically want to get. Now, the fear with the NRL, the Nature Restoration Law, was that we were being too ambitious, and that were actually dissuading people from supporting it because it just seemed ridiculous. And there is a lot of talk around it being watered down, and that yes, it has passed, but is it actually toothless? And I mean, you might say that, but realistically, it's something that is absolutely groundbreaking still. It's world leading. It's unprecedented, really, in terms of the commitments and the ambition, even with those watered down yet agreed levels of ambition. There's big challenges, like you said, Seth. The first main one is the economic cost of all of this. Not only in terms of the actual cost of the fence posts or the shovels to do the restoration, but also the opportunity cost of not farming that area as intensively, or not fishing this area as much, or whatever other economic impact a land user or a business or an entire national economy has, or experiences based on that. Now there are options for that. It's not going to be easy to fill those coffers. One of the best ways of modifying that may be to focus on what we're already spending, maybe optimizing that existing expenditure, be removing some of what we call harmful subsidies or minimizing those. In other words, robbing Peter to pay Paul, ecologically speaking. So we do need to get more efficient, but we also need to get a bit more creative in terms of where that funding comes from. The next big challenge is the administration around all of this. Is going to be massively burdensome. And the European Union is a complicated machine. It works fairly well most of the time. But with this level of ambition and the interconnected nature across so many different sectors and so many different societal components, trying to coordinate all of that and keep it moving forward, or at least prevent it from moving backwards, will be a big challenge. It is a big administrative machine. The third challenge is buy-in, is acceptability of this. And that's, I suppose, related to the economic cost, but also the more fundamental mind shift required for this. That even though it may not cost you anything, and there's an appropriate incentive put in place, and you're compensated, or a new economy emerges that you actually make more money from, the presumption is that if you bring this funding, people will accept it, and that's a little obtuse to presume. There have been societies and cultures built upon the use of these natural resources. So presuming that we can come in tomorrow and say, right, what your father, grandfather, great grandfather were doing for the last 200 years, that's wrong. Now do the opposite. Think of peatlands and the cutting of those and the dredging or the draining of those. So we need to be aware of the social acceptability and the social license to operate in a lot of these. And the last one is the unpredictable stuff, the stochastic, the turmoil, geopolitical shifts, the prioritization. I mean, a war is always going to be of greater priority than cozy, fluffy things that it's nice to do, but maybe we don't see it as high a priority as conflict or as the next pandemic. So building in the resilience in a system to ensure that any of those large geopolitical or health scares don't impact these ambitions as much as they could. I think that's going to be another big challenge.
So, final question. Looking forward, what do you think will be the most important milestones to watch for in the coming years as Europe implements the nature restoration law? And then also, what can listeners at home do to support this work?
Well, the nature restoration law is very ambitious targets to restore at least 30% of natural ecosystems by 2030, 60% by 2040, or 90% by 2050. So there's a lot to be done. And each member state at the moment is compiling its own national restoration plan. They're due to be finalized by mid-2027, with drafts, I believe, by mid-2026. Watch out also for EU and national initiatives which support biodiversity in the area of climate change in particular, including, for instance, what we call nature-based solutions, which use nature to help mitigate environmental impacts, including climate impacts such as sea level rise. Look for evidence that natural habitats are truly being restored, not just within designated protected areas, but in the wider countryside and urban areas where most of us spend our time. And what can listeners do to support that work? Well, get the message out to your friends and neighbors, and particularly to the likes of people working in business, farmers, and of course politicians. And don't be shy. There's so much war, prejudice, progressive politics out there at the moment. Let's inject some hope into this equation, and I think the nature restoration law is a real demonstration of what we can do if we really put our mind to it.
I love that idea of hope, Greg, because oftentimes we talk about nature in fatalistic terms, or certainly very negative terms. You know, we only ever mention the loss, we only ever mention the sad parts of it. There's very rarely any press releases around the positives of, species coming back from the brinks of extinction. Or maybe there might be a press release, but it's unlikely to be picked up by a newspaper. Bad news sells, so let's try and sell some good news too.
Could I ask one final question? Just like, you don't have to answer it and we don't have to include it if we don't want to, but I'd be interested to know what your earliest memory is of connecting with nature.
One of my earliest positive experiences, I suppose, was being out in Bull Island in Dublin Bay, which is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And I think it was in first class, so I would have been 7 here in Ireland. And our teacher, Mr. Whelan, he brought us out with his scope to look at birds. So I had no idea what a seabird was at that point, and definitely didn't know what an oyster catcher was or what a red shank was. But after that day, I was aware of exactly what an oyster catcher was. And I remember being quite cold and quite windswept, but being absolutely fascinated by the diversity of it and by the sheer numbers, and the fact that just because we're far away from those things doesn't mean that they aren't there, and they aren't doing an important role. So thank you very much, Declan Whelan.
Yeah, and I have very early experience. But God, I must have been about 3 or 4, something like that. I've been out with a couple of young friends somewhere in the countryside, and there was a beetle on the path in front of me, and I was going to squish it. And they said, "Don't do that! Don't do that! It's a living thing." And I'd learned my lesson from that day. Hopefully, I've been trying to reverse that crime ever since. Wait, or averted crime anyway. So yeah, look, I got very much into bird watching when I was around 10 or so. I'd seen some program on the TV, and I thought I'll give this a try. And I used to go out on my bike a lot into the countryside from where I lived. I was just on the suburbs, just on the edge of the countryside, some very nice countryside around Birmingham in England. And yeah, I had a load of fantastic experiences over the years doing that, and that took me to a lot of very exciting, exhilarating places, places like seabird cliffs, these cliffs with huge numbers of nesting seabirds. Everyone should experience places like that at some time in their life. It's really quite exhilarating.
You usually get shot on quite a bit in those places, though, Greg.
That is a risk. That is a risk. Everything has its downside. So Shane, you have a family crest.
Yeah, yeah. McGuinness family crest. It's got a red deer in it. I believe. I think it's got a red hand on it as well. Ulster.
I've got a lion. I don't think we have those here though.
That's so cool. I have a monkey. The Fitzgerald crest is a monkey.
What? Oh, there's obviously a Barbary connection to that, I wonder. Is there like there was a Barbary monkey from Morocco?
I got I got very excited about it, but then when I looked it up, it's actually just that the original Fitzgerald clan that moved to Ireland and developed the crest had a pet monkey. That was it. That was literally it. And they just loved that monkey so much that they put it on the crest.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Geez, I had a family
You must
scar
have.
in bed one.
Uh,
I'd pick it out for my aristocratic English ancestors, wherever they are.
you might own an estate.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not a turf plotter, maybe on a estate somewhere. Yeah, I don't think so though.
I found your crest, Craig. Can you guess what's on it? I think I found your crest, or Bullock
Oh,
crest.
okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah, guess what it is, Craig. What do you think
Something
it is?
belonging to the bovine family, no doubt. Yeah.
You got it. You got three
Okay.
bulls.
Okay. Okay.
It's pretty good.
Not sure that's a good or bad thing.
Ah,